Great. All right. Well, welcome everybody to the Jordan Center. Welcome those of you who are on Zoom. Thanks for waiting for us and bearing with us here. It is a great pleasure to have one of our postdoctoral fellows for the year, who we've been super lucky to have spend the year with us here at the NYU Jordan Center, Dr. Mariana Irby, present for us here today. And she's going to be talking to us about living as a Central Asian in urban Russia in the aftermath of the Crocus City Hall attacks. As she is a postdoctoral fellow at NYU, her research explores citizenship, borders, and the politics of difference in Russia and Central Asia. Drawing from 18 months of ethnographic fieldwork in Russia and Tajikistan, her current book project focuses on Tajik labor migration to and from Russia as a lens to explore race, ethno-nationalism, post-coloniality in the former USSR. Alongside this research, she's also engaged in activist-led projects with Central Asian migrant community in urban Russia. She earned her PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania in 2024, and her research has been supported by the Association for Slavic and East European and Eurasian Studies and American Councils and the State Department Title VIII funding. So, Mariana, take it away.
Thank you very much, Josh, for this introduction. When I had written the text for this, I was going to introduce myself. I forgot to normally somebody else does that for you. But thank you very much for joining me today. And yes, today I'm going to talk about what is a very important social, economic, and political topic in the post-Soviet region, particularly when you're talking about the relationship between Russia and post-Soviet Central Asia, and that is migration, the social realities that it produces, and I think it's very important to understand the Soviet legacies also in legal and social ambiguities surrounding the conceptual relations of citizenship in this region. And it's funny because the way this talk was advertised emphasizes the aftermath of the Crocus attacks in 2024, which I will discuss at the end. But what I really want to do in this talk is contextualize the phenomenon of migration between Central Asia and Russia. And so this talk is first and foremost about what I think is important for people to know about this particular corridor of migration, which is one of the largest in the world. And my aim is also to contextualize why these migration patterns are so durable, even with the ongoing war in Ukraine and the aftermath of the attacks, which have led to, one could say, a rise in xenophobic sentiments, policing of racial minorities in Russia. But these migration patterns, they remain in some ways quite stable. And so part of what I want to do in this talk is kind of contextualize why that is. And also to address, by the time at the end of the talk, when I actually address the attacks and their aftermath, something that I noticed a lot, when reading journalistic accounts and more superficial kind of policy analysis of what was going on, were many, I think, kind of misconceptions about these migration patterns and about the place of migrants in Russia that hopefully after my talk, I think it will be a little bit more clear. And another thing that I'm also really interested in addressing through this talk is a topic I'm sure of interest to many people here who study geopolitical dynamics in the region, is to give people a sense of the complexity of the topic of Russian influence in Central Asia. This is a term that comes up so often, relentlessly, in journalism and international relations, talking about the relationship between Russia and all of former Soviet republics, but Central Asia is no different. And of course, Russian influence is a very complex, multifaceted thing that is taking place throughout many centuries at this point. But I think when it comes to Central Asia, contemporary migration patterns to Russia are, I think, a very, grossly overlooked aspect, of that's important to understand when we talk about Russian influence. What is Russian influence when you're talking about societies like in Tajikistan, where most families have people working in Russia, people who have Russian citizenship, bank accounts in Russia, assets in Russia, travel to and from Russia on a very frequent basis. What's Russian influence in a society like that? So I think one of the big ideas that I want to put up right, at the beginning is that you cannot understand Russian influence in this region without taking migration into account. I've divided this talk into roughly two segments, and in the first part of the talk, I'm going to kind of historically situate this phenomenon. Why is migration an important thing to understand in the relationship between Russia and Central Asia? How can we locate this phenomenon within certain legacies of the Soviet past? In this section, I'm also going to talk a bit about how these countries have developed, particularly places like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, how they have developed this very remittance-dependent relationship with Russia today. And how that stems from the region's positionality within the Soviet Union and what it experienced in the breakdown of the USSR. I'm also going to note some major changes that have taken place in Russia that have led to the increase in migrant labor, particularly from Central Asia. As these are very, I would say, symbiotic. It's not just that migration to Russia has impacted Central Asia, but it has very much impacted Russia. So I'm going to start with this. Here's a chart with data from 2023 from the World Bank of top remittance dependent countries, both in terms of total amount of remittances and percentage of GDP, which is in red, blue and red respectively. And if you see here, the post-socialist world is quite well represented in these countries. And certainly when you're looking at countries in terms of the percentage of GDP, you have, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan have, these are really some of the most, these are the most remittance-dependent countries in the world. And of course, GDP is a partial metric of economy. It doesn't take into account very well informal economies under the table. But honestly, I think if you were even to include those more systematically within how GDP measures economies, you would see an even larger percentage of the Tajik economy as linked to remittances. That is money, wages earned by migrants and sent home. And when you think of what's going on here really, why are these countries in particular just become so remittance dependent? Of course, some of this has to do with the stories that we all know, the collapse of socialist economies and the broader instabilities produced by the political changes since the Soviet collapse. These collapses of former multinational states, of course, because of the USSR, and also there's a few former ex-Yugoslavian states here as well. The collapse of these formerly multinational countries. But there's also, I think, quite a bit more going on that's worthy of contextualization. And to do that, to understand what type of place Central Asia was in the Soviet Union, you need to understand that very large, largely rural populations, very high birth rates, much higher than the rest of the Soviet Union, very centered around the cotton economy in rural areas, highly dependent on the center for economic assistance, cash transfers. Tajikistan and several other countries in Central Asia were referred to as dotaционные республики, which you could translate to as a subsidized republic, meaning that they really depended a lot on the center for economic assistance of all kinds. Tajikistan, in particular, was the poorest republic in the Soviet Union. It was also the most rural, with over 80% of its population living in rural areas in the 1980s, which is huge when you think about it. I've also put the term here at the bottom, immobile, in quotation marks, because Central Asians were the least likely titular nationalities in the USSR to leave their republics. But I'm adding sort of a caveat that this is a bit of a construction, of course, because things like forced resettlements, both from European parts of the former Soviet Union to Central Asia, and then also within Central Asia, were also a very important part of the Soviet history in this region. But it's interesting because if you read the work of economists and sociologists in the late Soviet era, there were a lot of concerns about how to get the demographic surplus, this labor surplus in Central Asia, to kind of balance out the issues that were taking place in European parts of the Soviet Union, where labor shortages are a much bigger problem. And some of these debates also took on somewhat racialized overtones, attributing Central Asians disinclination to urbanize as part of their sort of biologically rooted aversion to modern ways of life. But there were a lot of concerns in the Soviet era about how to get Central Asians to urbanize more. Why don't they want to urbanize more? Why don't they want to live in big cities? How do we get this big labor, pool of labor to places in the Soviet Union where we need it more? But an overall important takeaway here is that Central Asia, on a demographic level, was also quite different from analogous societies in the global South. You had these populations living in very rural areas up, throughout the 80s. And if you look at a place like India, which is not so far from Tajikistan, has similar birth rates, throughout the 20th century, you had these big rural to urban rural to urban migrations that largely created this phenomenon of slums, for example. And in Soviet Central Asia, you really don't see that. And part of the reason for why this is, of course, was the Soviet economy and the fact that even in very rural areas, people had bare bones infrastructure, had access to, had jobs. You had many things that kind of disincentivized these rural to urban migrations that you had in other parts of the global South. But of course, this Soviet structure did not last, and what happened when all of it collapsed? Well, here's also a picture of the students, the Polytechnic Institute in 1972 in Dushanbe. And after 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, you had the first big wave of migration from Central Asia to Russia, and that was mostly ethnic Russians and other non-indigenous minorities. So that's Russians, Ukrainians, Tatars, Volga Germans, Koreans, Armenians, Chechens. And this initial wave of migration in the 90s, and you can see here how this is just the ethnic Russian population, and I will add, there are many other non-indigenous minorities in Central Asia who left with these migration patterns, but you can really see how it changed quite a bit. I mean, in Tajikistan, you went from 13.3% of the population being ethnic Russian to 0.5, which is a big, change. So this was kind of the first big exodus that took place from Central Asia. And in the case of Tajikistan, it was quite a fast, rapid exodus because of the civil war that the country had in the 90s. And that played a big role in kind of accelerating this overall societal breakdown at the time, because many doctors, teachers, scientists, technical experts, people in these positions were more likely to be ethnic Russians or other non-indigenous minorities. So when they started leaving, it created a lot of problems in a place like Tajikistan, really strained the public health infrastructure, education, and so forth. So there was this initial wave of outbound post-Soviet migration of predominantly non-indigenous people. But by the early 2000s, once the Russian economy started picking up steam, and what I mean by that is kind of developing industries that really relied on cheap, easily exploitable labor, in a country that had demographic issues, certainly, you start to really see more and more Central Asians, like indigenous Central Asians, coming to Russian cities and working. And it's kind of funny because in the Soviet Union, there was so many discussions about how to get this to happen, how to bring more Central Asians to city. But once that socialist economy collapsed, that's when, and new industries started coming up in Russia, like that's when people started to migrate. So I've situated a bit kind of the history of how this took place, but in part two, I'll explore, and this really gets more at the core of my own research of what it means to be a migrant in Russia. And I'll talk a bit about how the Russian state defines and manages different types of migration. I'm going to talk a bit about why data and statistics on migration are in many ways incomplete and problematic in this context. I'll talk a bit about what sorts of jobs Central Asian migrants tend to do, what sorts of opportunities they tend to pursue in Russia, and then I'll talk about what is really very central to my research about how racism and xenophobia can operate in this context. It's funny because if you were to do a Google search of Central Asian migrant, you would come across a very specific and very repetitive set of images of young men, usually in a crowd, usually having some sort of encounter with law enforcement. And it's quite remarkable how often images like this accompany journalistic and policy brief type accounts of Central Asian migration. And in some ways, they're a bit problematic because they can be quite dehumanizing, like a big mass of men and, wearing orange vests and doing certain types of labor, but that they also kind of flatten what is actually a very complex and diverse group of people. But before I get into that a little bit more, I'll back up a little bit to give some important, overview of what migration is in the context of Russia. According to the International Organization for Migration, in 2024, it was estimated that about 12 million migrants resided on the territory of the Russian Federation. Now, there are several major challenges to defining who is a migrant in this context, and most of them stem from interrelated legacies of the Soviet Union. There's the fact that most migrants in Russia are from former Soviet republics, which means they may have been born in the same country that they are now migrants in. There's a lack of a restrictive visa regime for these individuals. Because the countries in Central Asia, for the most part, pertain to the CIS, they do not need visas to enter Russia. And which means that they, while entering Russia, they're not necessarily going to be classified as a migrant. There's also the fact that, any person, for example, any non-citizen who enters Russia is going to be given a migration card, a migrazione carta, issued at points of entry. And that includes tourists, that includes students. And so simply being a foreigner entering Russia doesn't make you a migrant necessarily. And to make matters even murkier, there is no official legal definition of who is a migrant in Russian laws. One can identify two terms in Russia that are the governance of migration in Russia kind of hinges upon this particular distinction between labor migrants or trudovые migranты or compatriots, соотечественники. So compatriots, it's a very complex term, but it basically refers to non-citizens of Russia who have access to Russian citizenship. Much of this takes place through a process of resettlement. There is a program for the voluntary resettlement of compatriots that grants fast-track Russian citizenship, упрощенный порядок, in 3 to 6 months to people. And then there's labor migrants, who, and this is a more formal term in everyday situations. I would say the term that corresponds to this is gastarbeiter, or guest worker, which is a disparaging term, and I would say also quite racialized. Like, there's a very specific idea in mind of who a gastarbeiter is, and it's not someone from Belarus necessarily, that's quite associated with Central Asians in particular. But it's important to note that these categories, they're not necessarily fixed or stable. In my own research, and which I'll talk about in a little bit, with some graphic snapshots, many people spend part of their time as trudовые migранты, and then they get Russian citizenship. So people straddle these boundaries, also it's important to understand that a compatriot, technically, according to the law on compatriots that was adopted in 1999, can include any individual who identifies as having a cultural, legal, or spiritual set of ties to Russia, духовные связи. And it's really interesting because when you think about what would U.S. immigration look like if you could, in theory, claim a U.S. citizenship and obtain it within 3 to 6 months, if you resettle voluntarily to Idaho and work there on the basis of saying you have spiritual ties with the United States. I don't know. That's how things work in Russia now, and it's quite particular.
Can you say something about how that works in practice? Like, what is that actually? Or
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to get to some
okay. All right.
a little story that we'll show you a bit.
Okay.
And so, yes, and then keep in mind that while migrants from CIS countries, like in Central Asia, can enter Russia visa-free, they are required to legalize their stays. In Russia, that mostly happens through the fusion of work permit systems and residence registration, the прописка system, which I'm sure many of you are aware of if you've been to Russia, the former Soviet countries. But the laws surrounding the acquisition of these documents are in a state of near constant flux. And for this reason, it's very difficult to remain legally legible in Russia. Even if you are a trудовой мигрант, the laws about what you need in order to obtain a patent, the amount of money you need to pay for it, the types of documents that you need to obtain in order to get a work permit are very complex, always changing. And for this reason, it's quite difficult to really be legal in Russia if you're not a citizen. And this is one of the many reasons why Russian citizenship acquisition among Central Asians has really grown in the past couple of years. And this is another phenomenon that I pay a lot of attention to in my research. And in Tajikistan in particular, which has a bilateral agreement with Russia allowing dual citizenship, which in the other Central Asian countries, it's not official, but kind of tolerated. Tajikistan produced 174,000 new citizens of Russia in 2022, and which was a steady rise from the previous years. And in the first half of 2023, 87,000 people gained Russian citizenship, which would mean if that reflects the amount of number of people who got it in the second half would be even similar number to the year before. The Russian Federation has stopped issuing statistics on migration and citizenship acquisition in particular. I'll touch on that later when I talk about the aftermath of the Crocus attacks, but we don't have this data anymore. But it really is suggestive of how many people, I mean, hundreds of thousands of people for several years have been getting Russian citizenship from Tajikistan alone. And I think this is, why is this important to understand migration in this context? Well, one thing is that many migrants in Russia, they are citizens of Russia, and they would not be counted as migrants in any sort of statistics. If you have a Russian passport, you're not going to be included you're from a legal perspective, you're not a migrant. But many of these people, certainly, their day-to-day lives very much are as racially marked outsiders. And so to illustrate a bit how, these distinctions between compatriots and labor migrants operate in people's lives, I'll tell you a bit about Nargis, a woman who's very important to my research. She was born in 1992 in Dushanbe, and she first migrated to Russia to escape family pressures about getting married. She just wanted to explore. She wanted to do something different with her life. And she did not come from a privileged background. She didn't go to Russian-speaking schools. But she first moved to Saint Petersburg, where she worked at a kebab shop, handing out flyers. And then she later worked in Moscow, carrying out deliveries. And during this time, she describes herself as having been illegal due to her lack of a work permit. And she recounted a lot of stress and vulnerability that this led to her to experience. She coped with this precarity in a somewhat unusual way by going back and forth between Turkey and Russia. Turkey developed a visa-free, up to 90-day visa-free regime with Tajikistan in 2018. That's how she was living when I first met her. But her family, her parents and her siblings, by 2018, they had been living in Russia for several years, but they decided, because of the high cost of a patent, because of the stress of being illegal when you don't have a work permit, they decided to participate in the resettlement program for compatriots in order to get Russian citizenship. For this, making Russian citizenship, which is often how Tajiks describe this process, they take the Tajik, the Persian word kardan, and attach it to the Russian word grazdanstvo. So to make yourself a passport, to make yourself citizenship. For them, this involved relocating to Khabarovsk in the Russian Far East. But Nargis's family, like many others who participated in the resettlement program, they didn't have any desire to remain in such a remote area. For them, it was just a temporary relocation, work there for 6 months, get your Russian passport, and then go back to Moscow. And by 2022, Nargis herself, while she had been living back and forth between Turkey and Russia for a while, she decided to obtain Russian citizenship, which at this point she could apply for through her mother. She didn't have to actually resettle anywhere. And as of now, she's still trying. She got her documents together and is waiting for her Russian citizenship. And so I tell this anecdote in a way to kind of illustrate, how people kind of work within these programs in order to get Russian citizenship. But it kind of raises the question, has this mass increase in Russian citizenship among Central Asians, it has certainly improved their lives in some ways, but has it translated into more tolerance or more acceptance or less xenophobia? And my answer to that would be no. In fact, I would argue that it has played a role in fostering an environment of heightened hostility and mistrust towards racial minorities. But those who are racialized as Black or children in Russia, which can include Central Asians and Caucasians. And moreover, I think it's important to understand that in everyday discourse in Russia, racialized logics really shape and often define people's perceptions of who is a migrant, regardless of their actual citizenship status and regardless of whether they are, minorities who might be indigenous to Russia. In everyday social situations and in people's everyday kind of racist sensibilities in Russia, the fact that Uzbekistan is a country separate from Russia and Dagestan is a region of Russia does not make any difference. People's racist fears don't necessarily make those fine-grained distinctions and don't necessarily identify a difference. One very salient feature of contemporary racial hierarchies in post-Soviet Russia is how illegality really permeates and provides a justification for people's racist fears and prejudices. I would say that in Russia, illegal functions as much as a racial slur as it does as a reference to any specific documentary status. And of course, this has parallels elsewhere. This racialized understanding of who is an illegal migrant certainly is a very relevant thing to understand in the United States as well. But I think one of the primary differences in the Russian case surrounds the type of legal claims that illegals can make to Russian citizenship and the speed with which they can acquire it. And think of Nargisa, who I just talked about, and her family. They were living as guest workers in Russia, moving in and out of statuses of illegality, decided to do the resettlement program, got Russian citizenship, which certainly improved their lives. But they, when I got to know them, they were already Russian citizens, and they, continued to live in some ways sort of a life that is stereotypically associated with Central Asian migrants, all working in different delivery jobs, living together in a very small apartment in Moscow because of the very high cost of living there. And we're going to come back a bit to these race questions in a bit, but one idea that I really want to emphasize here is how, perceptions of illegality are a very strong part of people's prejudices in Russia, regardless of whether or not people actually, have citizenship or whether or not they're even indigenous to Russia. In fact, I recall reading about a terrorist attack in the Moscow subway that took place, a small one, in 2000. And apparently the mayor of Moscow afterwards said something promising. He blamed the attack on Chechens. I think the attack was never actually resolved, like who committed it, but I think it was suspected that it was committed by Chechen terrorists. And the mayor of Moscow came out in a statement saying that he promised to crack down on illegal migration in Russia, which is a very interesting comment to make in the aftermath of supposed terrorist attack supposedly committed by Chechens. But it really does illustrate how, this idea of people who are visibly marked as non-ethnic Russian, racially other, Islamophobia really plays a role in that. They're perceived as, their presence in Moscow is somehow not legal, regardless of whether they're actually from Russia or actually Russian citizens or whatever. And I think also, and another big point that I want to bring home here when talking about different migration statuses is how much people can move in and out of different statuses of migration. And especially when you look at the life trajectory of a particular person, you can see many different statuses and many different types of migration that really straddle or challenge a lot of the categories that you're often taught to think about and define when it comes to migration, like, is it temporary or cyclical, or is it permanent, or, is it high-skilled migration or low-skilled migration? I can talk, for example, also about another research subject very important to me, Safina, who was from Tajikistan and went first to St. Petersburg to study. She got a degree in architecture, then she dropped out of her master's program, and for a while she was working. She didn't have proper papers, and she was working at an architecture firm as an architect, but under the table. She would get paid in cash. And, what is this person? Is that like illegal? I mean, it's illegal, I guess, but high-skilled, low-skilled? I mean, it's a high-skilled migrant working illegally, technically. And so I think it's really important to kind of challenge what you think, the associations that you make. Okay, well, illegal migration is low-skilled. Well, not necessarily. And people can go in and out, they have a student visa, and then they're kind of undocumented, and then they apply for Russian citizenship. And I think also, it's very important, I've noticed also in like the whole NGO sphere, to try to classify different types of migration. Are you left behind, or are you a migrant? And I think for many people, they live within both categories. Back to the whole question of race. I think it's important to understand how migration from Central Asia in particular has been implicated in like contemporary ethno-nationalism and racism in Russia. And Central Asians work in all sectors of the economy, but there's certain, something I first noticed when I went to Russia too, that certainly in the big European cities in Moscow and Saint Petersburg, there's certain sectors of the economy that really tend to be quite populated by Central Asians. And if I had to show one picture that I think like captures the essence of what I just said, the racialization of a working class in Russia, is this Burger King advertisement that I saw once on the internet. It was circulating on social media a few years ago, and it was aimed at Kyrgyz people specifically, and was advertising high-paid work for Kyrgyz at a salary of 100 rubles an hour, which this was a couple years ago, but that would have been a couple dollars. And this was back in 2019, I think, when I found this. This is one illustration of what I'm referring to when I say certain sectors of the economy have tended to draw a lot from Central Asia. And that's really also important to understand when you, I think many outsiders have this understanding of Russia. They still really associate the place with like communism somehow, but urban Russia, like the cities I've spent time in for the most amount of time, are highly developed places for consumption, like really 24-hour nail salons. I've never seen that anywhere else in any other place in my life, but it's common in Russia. And 24-hour flower shops, like a type of round-the-clock consumer access that like really blows my mind on some level, and that I haven't seen in many other places. And this requires a pool of easily exploitable laborers. As a Muscovite friend of mine once put it, that the poverty of a place like Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan is why we can get sushi delivered in 15 minutes. So and I remember reading that for Yandex delivery, which is one of the big, like the whole world of app-based consumer delivery of food and goods that you can purchase really exploded since I first went to Russia. And I remember reading that like the Yandex delivery apps, the people who work for them, you can put them in like Uzbek, Kyrgyz, or Tajik. Like it's quite clear who tends to be working for these jobs. And another kind of phenomenon that I want to talk about when it comes to the issue of race in Russian cities is when you search for apartments and rooms for rent in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and probably in other places as well, you frequently come across this, a lot of references to citizenship status and ethnic background. The term "только славяне," "строго славяне," comes up quite a lot on digital housing platforms. And it comes in similar forms, such as stipulating that the prospective tenants give Slavic appearance, славянской внешности, or sometimes just coded citizenship requirements, like гражданство не рассматриваем, like we will not consider citizens of the SUG. I think here it's also pretty clear who they're talking about, like not Belarus, but Central Asia. And these sorts of ethno-racial preferences, they according to a research project that I did on this, they appear in up to 20% of housing ads in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Since 2021, a couple of housing platforms in Russia have banned these sorts of references to citizenship or ethnic background. But it's a very noticeable aspect of racial discrimination in Russia. And so it's one that I've thought a lot about, especially if I've reflected, how much it affects people that I know. And it's often got me thinking, like, who is a Slav? Why is this term in particular used? Where does it come from? And I would say that when you're talking about whiteness in Russia, the Slav, non-Slav boundary, or славянской внешности, не славянской внешности, is a kind of a local way, a local type of whiteness, non-whiteness. And in 2021. The singer who represented Russia in Eurovision, the last year that Russia was allowed to participate in Eurovision, was born in Tajikistan, actually, and she went viral with her music video, Nida Slavyanka, which you could translate to not quite a Slav or not Slavic enough, but it was her artistic representation of racism in Russia and what it means to live with that. It's a great song. I recommend you have a listen. And in many cases, myself, as an ethnographer living in Russia, it seemed to me that this was a particular boundary that really mattered a lot when it came to my encounters with the state, encounters with bureaucracy. Once my Moscow landlord, who himself was a dark-skinned Armenian, told me that I have a Slavic enough appearance, достаточно славянская внешность, when I expressed concerns about not having a прописка. And he said, oh, but you have a достаточно славянская внешность. And also, in several occasions, I visited Brazil, and I did quite a bit of research in Russia with that passport, because it has free access. And sometimes people would look at it and say, but you have a совсем славянская внешность, like, how are you from Brazil? But it really seemed to me, and it repeated discussions with my non-Slavic interlocutors, people, either Central Asian migrants or people from, Chechen, Tatar, Korean background, suggest that this is kind of one of the central kind of racialized boundaries in the country. And what's interesting is that I've spent a lot of time on housing ads in websites in Russia looking at this sort of stuff. I have accumulated a lot of it. I've never seen the term bieli come up as a description of what people are looking for or not. And that's not that Russian speakers never use that term. I mean, they do use it when they talk about racial hierarchies in the United States, for example, or in South Africa or wherever. But when it comes to, local ways of excluding others and kind of creating racial boundaries, it seems like the Slavyania is much more local. But I do think that, the category of Slavs and Slavic appearance, it suggests a heavily visual component to who is a Slav or not. Of course, nationalist is for external appearance. But I think there's also a lot more going on when it comes to these logics of race. I recall in the summer of 2018, among activist circles, there was this image circulating on social media of a woman, a job advertisement, like a help wanted poster, saying that they were looking for a woman with Russian citizenship, a Slavic appearance, and грамотная русская речь, educated Russian speech. And I thought this was an interesting picture because the woman behind the counter, interestingly enough, was a person who was not of Slavic appearance. And I recall like the outrage and the discussion that this like image incited on the digital sphere. But what it really got me to think about is kind of to reflect on the contradictions and the slippages through which, forms of racism exist and even thrive, Was the young woman behind the counter simply hired by a different person who posted the job advertising asking for someone with a Slavianskaya внешность? Or might her presence like reflect the different ways that people interpret who is a Slav and who seems like a Slav and who is Slavic enough? I came to similar conclusions following a conversation with a middle-aged Russian man who was sort of like advising me on some academic topics at the time, a professor. And he seemed quite uncritical about the practice of housing discrimination, and he fell back on the frequent defensive stances that I've encountered on online forums about this topic, saying that, an individual has the right to rent their apartment to whoever they want. Like, do you take it personally when people say no pets on the housing? Why would you take it personally when you say Crocus? And then I asked him whether he considered it at all unjust that Buryats, for example, who are indigenous to Siberia and the territory of the Russian Federation, might struggle to find housing in Moscow or Saint Petersburg. And he told me that Buryats, according to him, would never be discriminated against in these situations because they have a Slavic mentality. And Slavyania. And he said this to me and with a kind of subtle eye roll and like, duh, and Slavyania mentalitet, as if it's very obvious, of course Buryats would never, and what gives them this supposed mentality? Why is it that, according to these logics, a Buryat would have a Slavic mentality, but not a Tajik? You could point to Buryats' non-Muslimness. I think that's maybe part of it. Their level of Russification, their relatively benign political status in Russia, like compared to Chechens, for example. But for me, what I think this interaction really showed is how some people, at least in theory, can place a lot more emphasis on certain, practices or behaviors or mentalities when they're kind of making these decisions about who's a Slav, who's not a Slav, who has a Slaviansky mentalitet or a не-Slaviansky mentalitet. But I think, one of the main points here that I want to make is that I think you can really understand the whole Storka Slavyania phenomenon as a response to something that exists within a context of migration where the border is relatively unrestricted, where non-citizen minorities have access to fast-track Russian citizenship, and where, you could understand Storka Slavyania as a kind of social border within the Russian city in a context of migration that lacks, I think, at the same level of filtering and policing that you have in, in Western Europe or the US, perhaps. And I think it's also, a kind of a way of demarcating us and them in a situation where, I think even though it's been almost 35 years since the Soviet Union collapsed, I think a lot of Russian citizenship laws and a lot of how migration is governed still kind of operates with certain assumptions that people from former Soviet republics are not entirely foreign, and they have certain rights to Russian citizenship and they have certain rights to freedom of movement. And I think in some ways, the development of these types of discrimination and racism is kind of a pushback in a situation where some people would say like, the migration is not controlled enough, it's not restricted enough. And if you spend time on the internet and certainly reading comment sections, things like that, I spend a lot of time doing, I think it's one of the most frequent ways through which like racist prejudices are expressed is that we need to have regime. We need to have, you know, more controls. We can't just let these people get Russian citizenship. We need to vet people more. So it's, I think, a really, you know, I think Russia's relatively less restricted migration policy, they don't necessarily lead to more tolerance. I think in some ways they lead to a desire to kind of exclude more in more like grassroots way, whether it's when people are running their internet on their apartments on the internet, or housing ads and things like that. And then now reaching the part of my talk where I want to talk a little bit about more recent geopolitical phenomena that have taken place. So of course it's been more than 3 years now that the full-scale invasion of Ukraine took place. And that came with all sorts of disruptions and changes that, you know, kind of ricocheted into Central Asia. I mean, it's a country that's very dependent on Russia for remittances. So any big shocks in Russia, and whether that's the 2015 ruble crisis, the 2014 annexation of Crimea, the full-scale invasion, the pandemic also, and, you know, the closing of Russian borders, they really affect Central Asia very strongly. And then last year there was a terrorist attack in Moscow where 4 nationals of Tajikistan were charged with the crime of killing 145 people. I think that's the official death count at a concert hall. So these are things that have taken place. Both the full-scale invasion and the Crocus City Hall attacks have taken place since any time that I have been in Russia. I left there right before, finished my research there right before the full-scale invasion took place. And I've been back to Tajikistan since then, so I have some sense of how, you know, this is affecting people. But I think in some ways it's important to see, you know, the increased. It's true that there have been a lot of increased calls for visa regimes in Russia in 2023, but a lot of these have been taking place for a while. In 2023, Mikhail Matveyev, a Duma deputy, was asking, where are the Tajik battalions? You know, why are more Tajik people not going to fulfill their patriotic duties and going and fighting in Ukraine? And there's been changes also that were made to Russian citizenship law in 2023 that the Russian government can, in theory, strip people of their citizenship in a way that was not possible before, on the basis of criminal offenses, which includes draft dodging, like avoiding your what do you call it, mobilization, and yeah, other like terrorist attacks, and also some very vaguely worded legislation about anti-Russian acts or acts of hostility towards the Russian people or the Russian state could be grounds to strip somebody of their citizenship. So this took place in 2023. This was the last major set of reforms to Russian citizenship law. And they don't exactly restrict citizenship to Central Asians, for example, but they make it clear that this is a kind of conditional thing. You know, yes, you can get Russian citizenship easily if you're Central Asian, but if you avoid draft, or if we catch you avoiding a draft, if you commit a terrorist attack, your citizenship can be revoked. And I think in some ways, but I think there's these calls about like, where are the Tajik battalions? In some ways, they reflect a kind of uneasy relationship that the Russian state has towards incorporating these minorities in a way. And there's been a lot of, you know, it's very difficult to get accurate statistics about this because they're not published by the Russian Federation. And as I mentioned earlier, as of the second half of 2023, the Russian Federation stopped publishing most of its statistics on migration, especially about new citizens of the Russian Federation and where they're coming from. They didn't issue any statement about why this is, but I would say there's a very good chance that I think making it very clear how many citizens of Tajikistan are getting Russian citizenship is something that maybe they want to keep a little bit more hidden. And interestingly enough, also the government of Tajikistan stopped publishing a lot of its migration statistics, not that they were very robust before then, but I think that also kind of stems from a place of the government of Tajikistan not wanting to sort of obscure just how dependent the country is on migration to Russia. So in the aftermath of, this took place over a year ago now, in the aftermath of the attacks, many of my research subjects who reside in Moscow, who reside in St. Petersburg, expressed a lot of concern about how they were going to live in Russia. And, you know, a close family that I lived with there for a while They at first they went online and they were looking for tickets. They were going to go home, looking at how they were going to do it with their apartment and what they were going to, how they were going to relocate to Tajikistan. But then when the situation calmed down a little bit, they decided to stay. And I think this kind of reflects, I think many people have experienced a rise in xenophobic sentiments in public. Certainly, when I talk to my research subjects, the word nifrat, which means hatred in Tajik, comes up again and again and again when people describe what it's like living in Russia these days, this day and age, when you look, when you're racialized as other, as non-Russian. And certainly a lot of people, encounters with law enforcement also have been jacked up, more policing in the subways and things like that. But as I mentioned earlier, and I think something that's really, as I said earlier, very important to understand about these migration patterns is that, so many Tajiks have Russian citizenship, so many Central Asians have Russian citizenship. In 2022, according to statistics that were published in the Radio for Europe publication, about half of the citizens of Kyrgyzstan who reside in Russia are citizens of Russia, which is a lot of people. And of course, if you have a Russian passport, maybe you're going to get stopped more by the police, which is upsetting and frustrating and humiliating at times. And it's something that happens a lot in the Moscow subway. But if you have a Russian passport, of course, this makes your life a lot easier when it comes to kind of proving your legal legibility. A lot of a question that comes up a lot is, are these migration patterns going to change? Are these countries in Central Asia going to continue to be so dependent on Russian remittances? And, it's quite remarkable how stable a lot of this migration still is, despite all the difficulties, the risks now of getting drafted as well. But what I think I've observed, at least in the course of my research, is that people, like they did, following the war, like they did following the annexation of Ukraine, like they did following the ruble crisis in 2015, is that people just kind of adjust their strategies a bit. And there certainly have been, and among my informants, I certainly know people who, would have plans or have dreams of maybe trying to migrate to the US. Certainly, two research subjects of mine, actually the family of Nargis, who I mentioned, who got their citizenship through a settler into Khabarovsk, her two brothers, they got tickets to Mexico and they crossed the border into the United States, and they claimed asylum, actually. And they are currently living in San Diego and waiting for their asylum case to come, which is probably going to take a long time. And so there certainly are people who are, looking at other forms of migration. But, in 2023, 3,500 citizens of Tajikistan won US green cards. And in that same year, almost 180,000 people from Tajikistan received Russian citizenship. That's a really big difference in terms of access and accessibility. And so I think definitely, you will see, and you do see, certainly even in Brighton Beach, for example, I would say that the ethnic composition of migrants there, to me at least, has shifted to being much more Central Asian. To me, that's something that's quite noticeable. And so they're definitely, I think, the economic conditions in a country like Tajikistan are quite dire, and people will continue to migrate. So people will migrate to other places, but I think there's no other migration destination that can really replace Russia in terms of access, in terms of the ease of acquiring citizenship, the ease of entry. And these patterns of migration are also very established. And I will also add, I think that there's a certain type of, and I think this is something that's very developed throughout the Soviet Union too, a sense, certainly in a place like Tajikistan, that this economic dependence on Russia, that we need it in order to survive. I think it's something that has come up many times in my research that, if we lose, if they introduce a visa regime, here in Tajikistan, we're going to go back into the civil war. It's come up again and again and again, this idea of, if we lose this source of income, this migration ecosystem that we have, we're going to go right back into civil war. We don't have anything else. We really need our big brothers there. I think this way of thinking is still very, very strong. And it makes sense when you consider the fact that, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Tajikistan did fall into the civil war, in large part because they lost, this economic structure that was provided by the Soviet system. So, and it's very difficult to make any sorts of predictions, but my guess would be that these patterns of migration, they will really remain as a fairly stable part of Tajik society, Kyrgyz society, but people, will adapt their strategies a bit. And people are remarkably, savvy when it comes to strategizing, how to best, work within these migratory systems in a way that benefits them, whether it's, participating in a resettlement program to move to a rural area of Russia so that you can get a passport in a certain amount of time, or, employing whatever other means they have at their disposal in order to, in order to get by. So I think with that, we're at about a little over 45 minutes. So maybe we could
Great.
maybe have some discussion, and thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Crocus, are you watching the question line? Okay, so we want to invite questions now from the audience here, as well as from anyone online. If you're online, just raise your hand on the thing so we can get that. Okay, great. Yeah. Go ahead.
Mariana, thanks for the paper and thanks for the talk. I learned a lot. You talked about the pull factors, right? What makes someone move from Tajikistan to Russia, and so that factor being that, as you said, that Tajikistan has a dire economic situation right now. So I wondered if you could talk about you talked about the push. I wonder if you talk about the pull. Who wants them to come, and why, and how might they benefit from this hierarchy that you're discussing? For example, I was thinking specifically of the great picture of the tutti frutti. Right, so I was thinking, who, and then you showed the photos. Someone's taking those photos, right, and they are positioned in such a way, I'm assuming for a reason. So I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, sure.
I'm sorry for messing up the push-pull thing.
No,
You know what I mean.
Those are some really wonderful questions. So I think, yes, you definitely have to think about what type of place the Russian Federation is in order to understand why, why they need why they need both new citizens and why they need a pool of easily exploited cheap labor. I mean, Russia is interesting as a migration destination because it is both a top 5 migrant receiving country and a top 5 migrant sending country. The Russian Federation, and this is definitely accelerated since the mobilization and everything.
That statistic was pre-war?
Yeah. And it's remained that way. It's still on the top 5 for both sending and receiving. So, and I think many of you are aware, if you spend time in Russia, and this has been the case since the Soviet Union, it's not new. This whole idea of demographic crisis is very strong in Russia. Low birth rates, relatively high mortality rates, high immigration rates, which is I think it's called the demographic death spiral among specialists, population demographers in Eastern Europe is quite common. It leads to these very shrinking populations. And so Russia, in some ways, encouraging migration is a way to get the type of labor that you need in a country that has significant problems with labor, certainly in its deindustrialized peripheries especially. And it's interesting because when Vladimir Putin announced the introduction of the resettlement program for compatriots in 2006, he said that the point of this program was to give people an opportunity to return to their historical motherland and to address Russia's labor shortage problems. The exact relationship between these two things was not, and these potential groups of people was not made clear by him. But I think it's really important to understand the resettlement program, for example, and Russian migration policies more broadly as a way to try to bring excess labor to deindustrialized peripheries in Russia and to Russia more broadly. And I think the compatriots program is a way for the government to kind of do this in a way that theoretically prioritizes more Russified individuals or people who position themselves as compatriots, attracting migrants in a way that still seems, at least superficially, to prioritize, bringing people back to their historical motherland. But as I mentioned, many more Central Asians use this kind of as a loophole that's not intended for them, you could say. But so that's a big part of it. I think Russia, you really have to look at Russia's own demographic situation to understand why migration has pulled in so many people from Central Asia. There's also, corruption, when you look at the phenomenon, for example, of racialized document checks in the Moscow subway, which has become a big thing in the post-Soviet era, and it's something that's really increased since the Soviet era. I think you have to look at like the defunding of law enforcement, about the privatization of many sectors of law enforcement that have left certain state officials in law enforcement with much lower salaries. Yeah, it's a kind of like, the amount of money that you can make by seeking bribes from people that you profile racially, who you think have a high chance of maybe giving you money because they don't have their documents in order. That's a big part of what's going on, definitely. There's a whole like economic angle to it. There's also, I think there's a whole privatized sector in Russia of helping people get their documents together, helping them apply for things like the compatriots program, which can have very complicated paperwork, but it's largely non-state. It's privatized firms often that will help migrants get their documents in order and stuff like that. And that's a big business in Russia. It's brings in a lot of revenue. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. I think demographic issues, a whole economic, privatized industries that have centered, sprung up around migration. Part of it. Yeah.
I had kind of two questions that you kind of partly addressed one, so you can take it or leave it. But when you started talking about the compatriot program, I was immediately thinking, so this is like to try to steal Ukrainian citizens from Ukraine and this kind of geopolitical. So the question was, is there a racialized logic to the policy? Or I immediately wondered whether there was a racialized logic to the application, but then the data you shows that in fact, so is this, is it a discussion in Russia that, when we said, you said, spiritual connections to Russia, really we meant Ukrainians, not Tajik, is that, or then that if labor was an explicit also part of it, then maybe that's different. So that was one question. The second question was about the this legal-illegal distinction, which I think you showed so well, the sort of racialized discourse. I was curious about the actual practice, and the case you gave of the architect who is working illegally in an architecture firm made me think of this. So there's this clear racialized discourse of legality and illegality. Do the sort of practicalities of work actually align with that in any way? Are ethnic Russians, always working above board in all of these contexts, or are we talking about, is there sort of, I guess what is the sort of the practicality of legality in work in different contexts?
Wonderful questions. Thank you so much. Yeah, so the compatriots program, I wrote a lot about it in my dissertation. I just submitted an article for publication on this. I find it very interesting, and it's this program and like the laws surrounding compatriots, they come up quite a bit among scholars of Ukraine and Eastern Europe when talking about like Russian influence, Russian soft power, which makes sense in that context. And I think some, for example, talking from the Ukrainian context, some people see the compatriots program as a way to as part of the Russian state's expansionist tactics, as a way to set up a legal justification for current or future military interventions. The idea that, all these people in Eastern Ukraine, well, even if they're not technically Russian citizens now, they could be Russian citizens because of how we frame this whole Satieshvili thing, and that gives us the right to intervene on their behalf. And I think that's definitely an accurate way to describe, how these things function in the case of Ukraine. But I think the compatriots program, it's not just an ethnic return program. It's not just like, Aliyah in Israel or, the Oralman program in Kazakhstan to bring Kazakhs from China and Mongolia. It's not just like the Spätaussiedler program in Germany to bring ethnic Russians from the former Eastern Bloc. It's not just an ethnic repatriation program. It serves this function, but it's also very much a resettlement program, as it seeks, as Vladimir Putin said when he announced the program, to address Russia's labor shortages and to bring the excess labor from a country like Tajikistan that has this huge youth bulge, very high birth rates, very high unemployment rates, to parts of Russia where that labor is needed. And it's funny because when you think about, of course, a word like resettlement has a very long trajectory throughout Soviet and Imperial Russian schemes to, when it comes to certain types of migration, state-sponsored migration that has usually a forced aspect to it. But of course, like a lot of the forced, deportations and resettlements of the Soviet era, the Stalinist era, also had a very economic angle to them, wanting to send, labor from one part of the Soviet Union to another part of the Soviet Union. And so I think this is part of the reason. I mean, you can speculate all day about this. I think there's part of the reason why the compatriots program does not have an explicit ethnic, you have to be ethnic Russian or Slav or whatever, is because it's also part of its function it cannot be that restrictive, because a part of its function is to try to bring more labor from parts of the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, that have excess labor, and that's Central Asia. There have been, I mean, I can certainly send some of this your way if you're interested, but there have been many debates in the Duma since the adoption of the compatriots law, like throughout the past decades, criticizing the compatriots program, saying that it's not restrictive enough, saying that, well, terrorists and Muslims are coming into this program and we need to restrict it. There was, I talk about this in my dissertation, there was a big set of debates happening on Telegram with a bunch of Duma members and really getting worked up about the compatriots program. And a regional deputy in Kaluga actually announced the withdrawal from the resettlement program because too many fake compatriots were coming in through the program, basically. And so there have been many calls to restrict the program more, but they have never been successful. And so, and like I said, I think in part this is just because part of the point of the compatriots program is to also bring in more labor. It's not just about ethnic resettlement. And I would also add to that, I think Sotsieczestveniki is a very complicated term, in part because it does give some prioritization to people who are native speakers of Russian. And because there are native speakers of Russian who are not ethnic Russians, there's many native Kazakh speakers of Russian, there's many Central Asians who are native speakers of Russian. I think there is a sense, I think in the very complex and kind of, I would say, almost schizophrenic understanding of nationalism in Russia, there is a sense of duty and responsibility that the Russian state feels not only to ethnic Russians or ethnic Slavs in former Soviet republics, but to native Russian speakers, regardless of what their ethnic background is. And this idea of we need to protect Russian speakers is strong. And because that's not ethnically limited, I think this is part of the reason why the legal formulation of a compatriot is as non-ethnic as it is. And then when it comes to legality, illegality, also very interesting set of questions. And yeah, it's very racialized. I mean, being a face of Slavic appearance or whatever, I did not have a propiska. I was technically in some ways illegal. I was not residing legally in Russia. I didn't have a propiska for a lot of the time that I spent there. But I think that's just, it's not something that you worry about in the same way. I think if you're not the type of person who tends to get targeted by the police. And one of my research subjects, she's from Tajikistan, Russian citizen, and she worked in a wedding dress shop as a seamstress. And most of her colleagues, they were middle-aged women from Eastern Ukraine and Belarus. And many of these women were not Russian citizens, and I think some of them also did not have propiski necessarily. But if you're a migrant from Eastern Ukraine or Belarus, I mean, obviously there's a lot of Russian hatred towards Ukraine. So I'm not trying to diminish that at all, but I think you're not racially marked in the same way. You're not, and I think a lot of the kind of hatred that at least the Russian state has towards Ukraine is almost of a different character of denying their difference rather than emphasizing their difference. They're not really a different ethnicity, they're just like us. And I feel like that way of thinking kind of informs Russian policy towards Ukraine. So I think definitely, a lot of what it means to be migrant or illegal is very much it's a way of expressing racist prejudice in a way. And yeah, I think Torka Slavyania is a way of expressing this okay, if you're Ukrainian or you're Belarusian or whatever, or of Slavic appearance, it doesn't really matter as much what your citizenship status is or whether you're legal or illegal. But if you're, if you're even North Caucasian, even if you're from Russia technically, then it's a different story, So I think it's a way of kind of rebordering who the people are in the case of Russia. Yes, but I think certainly it's also, I think because so much of legality in the context of Russia hinges on whether or not you have a propiska, which is a legacy of the Soviet system, when the state issued housing. And that's part of why the residence registration exists. It's a legacy of a time when it was the state that would give you housing. And so in some ways it doesn't really make sense anymore, but it still has this residual effect of, many people in Russia, even if they're Russian citizens, they technically do not reside in the city legally. Like if you don't have a propiska, then you technically are not authorized to reside in the city. But very much the consequences of living that way are very different depending on how you look. Say.
Yeah. So I have two questions. One is just a kind of maybe a more technical question about this compatriots. And thanks for the fascinating talk. This has been great. Is that limited to former Soviet Union? Can you be a compatriot if you're not from the former Soviet Union? Okay, so it has to be former Soviet Union.
No,
you
sorry.
can be.
I was nodding at your question, like great question.
Yeah. Okay, so that's my first question, and I have a little bit of follow up to that,
Yeah,
depending on
sure.
how you answer. And I'd love to just hear more about like the process of determining who gets to be a compatriot. Is this just like is there like a rule book and it's followed? Is it like very arbitrary? Is it bureaucratic? Does it differ based on where you are in the country?
Mhm.
The second question I have is about how the war has changed the desire of Central Asians to come to Russia. And I could imagine it going both ways, right? Like fear of getting drafted and getting caught up in it, or access to the bonuses for getting drafted would actually lead to a bigger, counterintuitively, like a bigger pull, because now the economic thing, the stakes are higher, but if you can get in and out in a year or two of service, you can make so much more money. So two different questions, but I'm interested in that.
And two very, very important questions. So the first, I'll address the first one first. The compatriots program. So technically, you do not have to be a former Soviet citizen in order to participate in the program. Though I think it's quite clear that a lot of the Russian citizenship law in general, especially the fast track options, which include the compatriots, getting citizenship through the compatriots program, are very geared towards people from former Soviet republics. I mean,
So like we had a speaker, one of our visiting scholars a while ago, who was doing a project on the rise of Russian Orthodoxy in Appalachia. Like, could you get people like coming out of that community and deciding they wanted to move to Russia, taking advantage of this program?
So like there are communities of old believers, for example, in different parts of the world, in South America, and many of these people have repatriated to Russia through the compatriots program. So it does not necessarily have to be people from former Soviet republics. I've also heard some citizens of Syria have been able to get fast track Russian citizenship also through similar procedures.
Like Assad.
Yes, and also, and I think like kind of framing these people as somehow part of the Russian nation or brothers or something like that.
Right.
I've heard of these cases, but it is first and foremost really set up for post-Soviet migration. Because in theory, you have the grounds for Russian citizenship if you completed a Soviet university degree, if you served in the Soviet military, if you are a descendant of somebody who served in the Soviet military. So, I mean, basically, in some way or another, almost everybody from a former Soviet republic could, in theory, claim this status. Now, there's a lot of other things involved. You often have to take a Russian language test in order to apply for the program. But there's a whole, coming back to James' question, a whole privatized black market for obtaining these documents. And back to your question about like how there was a very interesting case of a Duma member, the one who pulled out from the compatriots program in Kaluga, actually, he did this because he went to a migration office where he realized how many of the people applying for citizenship through the compatriots program had fake Russian language citizens, language certificates and things like that. So there's a whole black market of granting people the documents, and not even necessarily for people who do not speak Russian. Like I had a good Tajik friend of mine who was considering doing the compatriots program, and she spoke Russian very fluently. And I was like, oh yeah, well you can do the Russian language test, no problem. And she's like, oh yeah, but I'm not going to do. You can just pay someone to do that for you. It's very common.
Right.
So so you apply through the compatriots program. You often have to show some form of in order to so that you can just apply for Russian citizenship without resettling, and then you have to show either that you are the parent or the immediate kin of somebody with Russian citizenship, a spouse of somebody with Russian citizenship, or you have these Soviet connections. But if you're doing the resettlement program, you have to resettle to an underpopulated part of Russia, work there for a certain amount of time, pass a Russian language test. You also, upon receiving your Russian citizenship, you have to take an oath promising to respect the values and traditions of the Russian people or whatever. But it's, yeah, I think if you don't have these like Soviet era connections necessarily, or if you don't have immediate familial connections, it's one of the easiest ways to get citizenship. But you often, you have to relocate to a place that may not be very favorable.
Can I follow up? And so say you're a Tajik migrant who comes, why would you not do the compatriot program? Like,
I guess if you don't want to move to Khabarovsk for 6 months or up your
Okay.
life in this way, I mean, there's also
so if you just kind of want to go to Moscow and work construction projects, there's no real benefit. to it.
exactly, and you have to pay. I mean, there's money involved also.
Okay.
Both of applying. If you want to take like get the Russian language citizenship, I mean, Russian language certification, like all that stuff it's money. And definitely if you're doing it through semi-legal means, I mean, there's a big informality culture of bribes and everything. And I think from what I've seen observing people getting documents in Russia, it's kind of, you sort of have to engage in that on some level in order. If you want to get things done, you have to bribe someone. And that takes money. I mean,
Right.
people, save up a lot of money and put a lot of energy into getting these documents. But I think it's often seen as an investment. For people who really want to have Russian citizenship long term, it makes sense to pay the money that you have to in order to get these documents together, so that later on you don't have to pay money for a patent, or you don't have to pay money to corrupt police officers or things like that. And then the second question that you had was about the war. So I haven't been back to Russia since then, and I have been back to Tajikistan. And a lot of what I can tell you is just anecdotal, because there have definitely been reports of the Russian state, for example, migration officials, when they detain someone who's like illegally residing or working in Russia, offering or even like forcing people to enlist in as a kind of, or sometimes as an, well, we can like lock you up and deport you, or you can go fight in Ukraine for a year, and if you survive, then you're a free man. And there's also been reports about people Russian citizenship being offered to people who agree to fight in Ukraine, which is terrible. It's quite manipulative. It's also very much takes advantage of the fact that Tajiks, for the most part, are very poor. And you're right. I mean, personally, my network of informants, I don't know anybody who is, at least who's telling me that they're going to fight in Ukraine. But it makes sense, and it's something I have to research more systematically. I think it makes sense if you're economically desperate and you get offered some sort of like sweet financial deal to go fight in Ukraine, that some people might do it. But for the most part, what I have observed in Tajikistan, I think most people are not, I don't know, reluctant to go participate in a war that they don't necessarily know a lot about. I think a lot of people who
Are reluctant.
But
I mean, does that make them less willing, more reluctant to participate in this traditional like migratory economy of going to do construction in Moscow because you're afraid
of getting
dragooned into the thing? That was like my original thought. And then I thought, well, given some of the discussion we've had here at the Jordan Center about like the bonuses that are being paid to Russians in rural areas, that if that is sort of big money for Russians in rural areas, it must be even bigger money for Tajiks who's ended up in Russian rural areas and stuff like that. So that's what I was trying to get a sense of, if we knew if it was, and it could also be nothing. It could just be like, this is not really on the radar screen. If you're already desperate enough to want to do this and put up with what you're going to have to put up with, that's just another risk, and people are doing it because it's a desperate situation. So I could imagine being all of those things. It could have decreased the desire of Central Asian migrants to come to Russia. It could have had no effect on it, or it could have paradoxically had this actually increase it. Yeah, but do we know in the aggregate which is predominant?
I mean, there's not a lot of like statistics on this, right at the moment. I mean, I can say certainly from my own networks and reports that people definitely continue to migrate to Russia, but I think with much more of, for those who are Russian citizens, with much more of a caution surrounding, maybe being mobilized. For those who are not Russian citizens, a lot more aversion to authorities, perhaps, and not wanting to get, deported to Ukraine. I think, Tajikistan in particular is just very economically dependent on Russia. Like, I think for a lot of people, they don't necessarily have the option of never going or never making money in this way. I will also say that I think for a lot of my networks of research informants, the ones that I'm very close with are women, actually. So, and I think for women, of course, a lot of these sets of issues are quite different because they don't run the risk of being deported. I think I will say though, on some, in Central Asia is an interesting place in that there is a fair amount of, what you could say are like Kremlin narratives surrounding the war in Ukraine. Like most Central Asians have very heterogeneous media consumption patterns. Like I remember being in Dushanbe on Dien Pabyedi in 2022 and watching like them flipping through different channels and just seeing how differently people were portraying like, well, these Moscow celebrations of Dien Pabyedi and how they relate to the war in Ukraine. And so I think, and just in general, yeah, just very, in some ways, I think some Russian state narratives about the war in Ukraine might influence people on some level. But I think also, I mean, many Central Asians also watch Turkish news. They also watch like diaspora Russian media. They also watch, Russian dubbed, Turkish, whatever, a lot of very different types of narratives about what's going on in Ukraine. And I think most people do have like a very critical stance, I guess. But I think what it's made most people do is just like fearful of the economic circumstances, and just very aware of how precarious their status is, even for people who are citizens, has created this, and these new laws that can potentially strip people of citizenship now if they, if they avoid drafts or things like that.
Right.
So yeah, I don't have a very clear answer for you, but I think all of what you're describing, I think some people do get lured into these sort of manipulative offers. I think some people, they continue to work in Russia, but maybe, are hoping to, apply for a green card or something like that, or looking to other options. I think for some people, they just really are thinking about how to feed their family. And this war in Ukraine is just like the latest of many ongoing crises,
And risk, it's like one of.
Crises and risk, one of several risks. Because of course, dealing with potentially being deported, having to bribe police so you're not deported or whatever. Now there's this added element of war in Ukraine, but it's not, these things existed before, figuring out how to deal with police and how to avoid risks is, one of something that's been happening for a long time.
What do you think?
Yeah,
Thank
thank you so much. This is super interesting. You spoke about it a little bit in terms of like the privatized efforts in response to James's question, helping Central Asians with their documents. But I'm wondering, given the challenges and precarity that a lot of the people you got to know face, is there any kind of like grassroots or civil society initiative, either within their own circles or from external circles, to kind of support with this, like whether this is kind of more formal civil society organizations, or is it kind of like more informal networks of other Central Asian migrants like helping one another? I'm interested in these kind of like ecosystems.
Yeah, definitely, and that's a really wonderful question. So I can say that during a lot of my research, this particular part of it that I did in St. Petersburg, so I spent about half the time in Moscow, in St. Petersburg when I was in Russia. In St. Petersburg, I was very involved in a grassroots network of activists, like an organization that helped Central Asian families and children, and through this organization that provided tips on how to get legal counseling, how to enroll your children in school, how to get medical care. We also wrote a publication in Tajik, Uzbek, and Kyrgyz targeted at women at how to, giving them information also about how to deal with their legal issues and things involving their children and families. Through this organization, I used to teach English and Russian classes to mostly children, but also adult migrants from Central Asia at different local libraries. So that's my experience in this world. I will say that one thing that's very noticeable about Russia is that there are a lot of informal networks of Central Asians who are more established, helping other Central Asians who are less established. But I think one thing that's really surprising in Russia is that as a country that has as many migrants as it does, how little in the way of civil society there is in terms of helping people, live there. And also just and beyond civil society, also just like on an institutional level, like something like ESL for kids, like, an acknowledgement that there are many children in Russia who like don't speak Russian as their first language and maybe need some help with learning Russian. Like this just doesn't exist in Russian schools. And I think the country is like there aren't all that many non-governmental organizations that assist migrants. And I think part of that is also because now, the organization that I used to be involved with, they were very successful in kind of like working within the official Russian state regulations, and they were very successful in getting Russian state grants for their project. Because of course, if you're a non-governmental organization in Russia and you get any sort of foreign support, especially if you're dealing with, if you're explicitly dealing with like migrant children or anything like that, you're not going to survive, or you're going to be very, politically targeted. And even the organization I worked for faced a lot of issue because the publication that I was talking about earlier, we had like a Swiss grant for that, some Swiss money and making this newspaper, and that got shut down. So, or we had to stop using that money in order to survive as an organization. So I would say the landscape, the civil society landscape for migrant rights and stuff like that is very limited in Russia, unfortunately, which is really too bad. And there are, of course, like informal networks of people who, acquaintances assisting each other, but there's beyond like the privatized sphere, there's just not a whole lot. Which is, very, very unfortunate. I would say, it's very impoverished landscape for, which is surprising for a country that has that many migrants. And there have been also, recently they just passed in the Duma a very unfortunate law, which is that children who are not, who do not have a basic level of Russian proficiency cannot go to school, cannot enroll in Russian schools, which is very frustrating and upsetting because it's like, what are these kids supposed to do? And they're just going to stay at home. And I know from my own like networks of research subjects of stories like this where kids don't speak Russian well enough to go to school. And even before this passes a law, like many schools also will not, take students who don't have a certain level of Russian. So then the kids just have to, if they're in Russia, they just have to like stay home and watch TV or whatever. It's really unfortunate. And they're trying to pass laws also that only children who are like legally residing in Russia can attend schools as well. So very, very unfortunate. But my main answer to your question is that it exists, and I've been part of these activities, but it's very ground level, very grassroots, like not a lot of.
So are these communities the ones with the I'm sort of fascinated, but just by kind of watching what's happening in the United States, right now, with the idea that like Putin is, or the Russian state is understanding the labor shortages and are trying to address the labor shortages, watching the sort of, populist rise in the US by sort of targeting immigrants at a time when we really are having a decreasing, or not a decreasing labor supply, but if enough of the deportations happen, it will have a real impact on the US economy. And but understanding the politics behind why they're doing this. So it sounds like in Russia, there's like a tension here between one part of the state that wants to have these migrants in the country and the other part that is fearful of them for the reason that you have sort of populist movements everywhere, or right-wing movement, whatever you want to call it. And so is the issue here that like, when you talk about like these kids not being able to go to school, is the thought that is that there's a goal here to get the migrants, but not get anything else. And so you make it unpleasant for people to bring their families, so you just get the workers, and then you don't have to deal with any of the rest of it, any sort of threat. Or is it that this actually represents a fault line, that there are people who just really don't want to have the migrants, period, and they have a more local perspective, like, not in my town, I want my town not to have these kind of people around, versus the state is like, well, we need for the economy, we can't fund the war effort if we don't have enough labor or something like that. So do you have a sense of which of those it is, where it's just like where this is coming from?
Yeah, I think what you're describing is very accurate. I think in some ways you could see the push to like make it much harder for Central Asian children to go to Russian schools as a way to disincentivize more permanent forms of migration. And to rather, I think for some people in the Russian government, absolutely. And I think that what their ideal scenario would be Central Asian like laborers who come and like address the shortages and the deficits that are good for the Russian economy, but they don't mooch too much, they don't infringe on our space too much.
So like a never-ending supply of young men or women who then leave when they get a little bit older and get replaced by other people.
Yeah. For some people, that's what they would want. And I think, and also there's been quite a bit of controversy also surrounding Материнский капитал, which is the Russian state, one of its pronatalist kind of initiatives to try to encourage women to have more children, offering benefits to women who have more than 2 children in the form of vouchers, in the form of like housing subsidies, things like that. There have been a lot of pushback of Central Asian women who are citizens of Russia using this program, and the average birth rate of among Central Asians is much higher. And so there's definitely been efforts, and I think they may have been successful in some jurisdictions to limit Materinsky Kapital to women who have had Russian citizenship for 10 years or more, or something like that. So basically, if you're a recent citizen of Russia from Tajikistan and you have 4 kids, okay, that doesn't apply to you. Like, we don't want to encourage that. If I think Russian women are having 4 children, great. We want to make that as easy as possible, but not those people. Yeah, so I think there's definitely a lot of, as you described, tensions between wanting to promote certain types of migration because it really is beneficial economically to Russia, but then also a lot of, these migrations, they are a big part of the ethno-nationalist and racist fears that are also very evident in Russia of wanting to promote the Russian nation and the Россия для русских. And I remember once in one conversation with somebody, they even told me that they justified the invasion of Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea, the whole Novorossiya thing is like, well, we need those lands. Like, how can you tell us that we cannot do that when look at how many migrants we have coming into Russia? Like, we're going to be a minority in Russia. So ethnic Russians are going to be a minority in Russia, which is like not even really true. But we have to take those places because in order to balance things out, it's our right, basically. If we're getting attacked by migrants, well, we need to claim the ethnic Russian majority parts of Ukraine in order to preserve our nation where it needs to be preserved. So yeah, there are a lot of these, tensions very much.
But this is kind of going off that. I mean, what are is race legally codified in Russian law in any way? I mean, are there like legal racial categories? Because a lot of this kind of, I mean, it's like I forget, there's an article that had this title, but it's like a racial politics in the absence of being able to say you legally are, non-white, and therefore we can legally do certain things, right?
No, there aren't, and that's and it's so in the literature on race in Russia and in the Soviet Union and stuff. I think one of the biggest, which is a burgeoning thing, definitely since the invasion of Ukraine and the kind of like colonization of the field and stuff. Though it's not new, also definitely existed since the 90s. I think one of the biggest qualms that some people have about discussions about race in Russia is that, oh, well, nationalist is the main local way of talking about difference, and that's better translated as ethnicity. But I also, I think that certainly many of the ways of thinking that went into nationalist in the Soviet sense, a very primordial understanding of ethnicity, that it's, something that also got written on your passport, it's part of your, right next to your address and your phone number and your name and everything, there's your nationalist. It's a really integral, fundamental part of who you are. And it's an inherited status too. Like, every Soviet citizen had to write their nationalist. They couldn't just put Soviet. They couldn't put 2. They could only choose one of their parents' nationalities. So a very almost kind of like biological inherited way of thinking about ethnicity. I think, and in my opinion, that doesn't disprove the idea of race, but I think it really, racist ways of thinking really developed quite strongly within the Soviet system. I mean, and you have, there's no legal codification of who is a, лицо славянской or неславянской внешности. But that's, I would say a racial category, and that it does not, it's goes beyond, or is a lot less, it's murky in a way that these officially sanctioned categories of nationalist are not. And I think that that's really important to understand race, and certainly in the Moscow metro, when a police officer decides who they're going to target for, a document check, it's often based off these like split-second judgments and a kind of logic and a scanning of people that I think goes beyond nationalist. And certain racial terminologies in Russia, like calling someone, these aren't offensive terms, but like a черножопый гастарбайтер, a black ass migrant, that is a common racial slur in Russia. I mean, how can you say that that's just prejudice on the basis of nationalist? I mean, there's no черножопая nationalist. It's a racial slur. It kind of, it goes beyond these fixed categories to create more murky distinctions. And I think that's kind of where race thrives and lives. Another interesting example, there's another racial slur that is called khach, which originates, it's the Armenian word for cross. And originally, I think the term khach was more specifically limited to Caucasians, and a kind of, a racist term for people Kafkaskian nationality. But when I lived in Moscow, it definitely became clear to me that the word Hach is also used for Central Asians. And when you think about this, like, it's kind of weird, the Armenian word for cross became a racial slur that is also used towards Muslims from Tajikistan. Like, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. But that's kind of the logic of racism, that, you know, okay, you're different, you're brown, you're not like an ethnic Russian, and it doesn't matter if you're Caucasian or, you know, if you're from Dagestan or Uzbekistan or whatever, like, you know, people, these racist terms, these racial categories, they don't make those sorts of distinctions.
Like very different from nationality, where you would never, you know, conflate an Armenian with a new.
Exactly, exactly. And so nationalism, certainly in the Soviet context and also in the post-Soviet context, has a very kind of legal grounding. And in the Soviet Union, it was a legal status. Also, it was very tied to territorial rights. Nationalists were, you know, territorial administrative units also within the Soviet system. And racist terminologies, and a lot of these terms like chornezhov and Hach, like they originate from the Soviet Union. They didn't come up only in the post-Soviet era. Yeah, in some ways they come from a very different logic that is much more like focused on a person's appearance and much less on their official documents. But yeah, it's quite. There have been like interesting changes also in the Russian Federation from the Soviet Union in terms of like, for example, the Russian passport. The first passport of the Russian Federation was issued in 1997, which itself is kind of indicative of how long it took for sort of these documentary regimes to catch up with the collapse of the Soviet Union. People were still using Soviet passports for a long time. But one of the biggest changes and controversies about the new Russian passport that was issued in 1997 is that it did not include nationalists. It did not include the fifth line of nationality that had been in Soviet passports. And interestingly enough, the biggest pushback of that came from ethnic minorities within Russia. So a lot of, and I was reading about this recently, like a lot of discussions in Chechnya, for example, some public leaders in Chechnya going so far as to call this a genocidal or ethnic cleansing. The fact that we don't have Chechen on our passport anymore is a sign of the Russian state trying to wipe us away. And of course, if you consider what was going on in Chechnya in the 90s, you know, it's understandable why, you know, they would have this reaction. And of course, if you consider the bigger history of, you know, the deportation, mass deportation of Chechens under Stalin and everything. But I think it does, yeah, reflect how much the notion of territorial rights was tied to nationalist as a legal category in your passports. When you think about the fears and anxieties that Chechens and Tatars had when the new Russian passport came out, oh, we don't have that anymore. That's a sign that our rights are as minorities are gone now. Yes. But yeah, I think I think all the discussions about, I'm very excited, definitely about like all the new literatures that are coming out about race in Russia, because I think it's, you know, I do get frustrated sometimes by scholars who are like, oh, no, you know, race in Russia, you know, that's an American category, you know, it's a Western category, it's a foreign category, we don't have race in Russia. And it's like, come on, like when you read housing requirements that are like Только Slavyane, like how can you say that that's not racism, you know? And even Slavyane in this case, like, okay, technically that refers to a concrete group of people, but when you're talking about Slavyansky внешности or whatever, like, you're really in the realm of racism there. Like, you know, people who look a certain way, you know, not being excluded from certain spaces. But yeah, the Russian state does not have like official definition of that category.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I think we're almost.
Yeah, we're over time, but it's such an interesting topic. Everyone's been talking. Are you good? Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mariana. This was totally fascinating. This was great. Thanks everyone on Zoom.